The room in Ghent did not look like the beginning of a European struggle. There were no burning villages outside the windows, no army waiting in the rain, no king standing over a conquered city with a sword raised toward heaven. Only a young woman. Only a contract. Only candlelight touching parchment, wax, and the nervous hands of men who understood that a signature could move borders more quietly than an army. In August 1477, Mary of Burgundy married Maximilian of Habsburg. To anyone watching only the ceremony, it might have looked like another noble marriage in a century already crowded with alliances, promises, dowries, and dynastic bargains. A bride in the shadow of grief. A groom from a powerful but still uncertain house. Courtiers measuring every gesture. Clerks preparing every phrase carefully, because words written in the wrong order could become a war. But this marriage was not merely a union between two people. It was a door. Behind Mary stood the inheritance of Burgundy, one of the richest and most dangerous political prizes in late medieval Europe. Her father, Charles the Bold, had died earlier that year at Nancy, leaving behind no surviving son to secure the Burgundian lands in the old, simple language of male succession. What remained was a question Europe could not ignore. Who would control Burgundy's wealth, its cities, its roots, its prestige, and its claim to stand between France and the Empire? The French crown wanted the answer to be obvious. The Habsburgs wanted the answer to be lawful, and Mary herself stood in the middle of that answer, not as a romantic figure painted safely inside a legend, but as an heiress under immense pressure. Her body carried claims. Her marriage carried territory. Her womb, if politics was fortunate, would carry the future. This was how medieval power often worked when it was most honest about itself. Not in speeches, not in songs, but in inheritance. For France, Burgundy was too close, too wealthy, too strategically placed to be allowed to drift into Habsburg hands. For the cities of the Low Countries, the question was not abstract. It meant taxes, privileges, trade, military protection, local freedoms, and the survival of urban wealth built through cloth, markets, ports, and hard negotiation. A merchant in Bruges or Ghent did not need a poet to explain dynastic politics. He could feel it in the price of security, in the interruption of trade, in the fear that a distant prince might arrive with soldiers and call it lawful rule. Somewhere in that city, a clerk might have warmed red wax beside a flame and pressed a seal into it with steady hands. The seal would cool. The parchment would be folded, the words would be preserved. And beyond the room, men would die because of what those words made possible. That is the first lesson of the Habsburg story. They did not avoid war. That is the childish version of the legend. The Habsburgs fought, lost, negotiated, retreated, endured, and fought again. Their rise was not clean. It was not gentle. It did not float above the violence of medieval Europe as if marriage were some peaceful alternative to bloodshed. But they learned something that many louder dynasties understood too late. War was expensive, uncertain, and temporary. A battlefield could win a province for a generation. A marriage, placed correctly inside the machinery of inheritance, could give a family a legal claim that outlived the men who first objected to it. A sword could take a gate. A wedding could take the future. That was the terrifying elegance of Habsburg power. They became masters not simply of fighting, but of waiting. Waiting for a duke to die without a son. Waiting for a princess to become an heiress. Waiting for a treaty to ripen into a claim. Waiting for a child born in one court to inherit the anxieties of another. To modernize, it can look almost absurd. Europe rearranged by marriages, cradles, deaths, and contracts. But in the world of the Holy Roman Empire, Burgundy, France, Austria, Castile, Bohemia, and Hungary, bloodline was not private. It was infrastructure. A daughter could become a border. A son could become a treaty. A marriage bed could become a diplomatic frontier. And no family would become more famous for understanding this than the Habsburgs. Their enemies often had larger armies at a given moment. Their rivals could be richer, more glamorous, more admired, more feared. The kings of France possessed a more compact kingdom. The dukes of Burgundy shone with courtly brilliance. The Luxembourgs had Prague and imperial prestige. The Swiss would humiliate Habsburg arms in mountain passes. Bavarian rivals would block them. Electors of the empire would resist any attempt to make the German crown into family property. Again and again, the Habsburgs met the limits of force. But limits are educational. A dynasty that cannot always dominate the battlefield may begin to study the archive. It may learn to love titles, seals, genealogies, marriage contracts, investitures, privileges, and the slow violence of lawful succession. It may discover that the quiet room can sometimes do what the battlefield cannot. The wedding in Ghent was one of those quiet rooms. Mary's marriage to Maximilian did not instantly hand the Habsburgs a peaceful Burgundian empire. It produced resistance. It intensified conflict with France. It placed Maximilian inside a political world that was wealthy, proud, urban, and difficult to control. Burgundy did not simply fall into his hands like a ripe fruit. Inheritance never works that cleanly. A claim is not the same as obedience. But the marriage changed the argument. From that point forward, the Habsburgs were not merely outsiders reaching toward Burgundy. They were family. They could speak the language of right, not only ambition. They could claim not just that they wanted the inheritance, but that history, law, and blood had placed them inside it. That difference mattered. In medieval politics, naked ambition was dangerous. It needed clothing. It needed ceremony, genealogy, church blessing, legal phrasing, noble witnesses, and enough armed men waiting nearby to remind everyone that law without force was only ink. The Habsburg genius was not that they chose marriage instead of power. Marriage was power. Not soft power in the modern harmless sense, not romance, not pageantry. Marriage was a weapon made of legitimacy. It could be kissed in public, blessed by priests, celebrated with music, and still redraw the strategic map of Europe with ruthless precision. That is why the old phrase became attached to them. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It sounds almost playful. It was not. Behind the phrase was a method. Behind the method was a worldview. The Habsburgs saw that Europe was not one solid political body, but a puzzle of jurisdictions. Duchies, counties, crowns, bishoprics, cities, privileges, and succession laws. In such a world, conquest was only one way to assemble power. Another was to wait beside the family tree with a contract in hand. And yet this method carried a danger of its own. Every marriage that brought new land also brought new enemies. Every inheritance brought local customs, resistant nobles, suspicious towns, rival claimants, and old conflicts that now became Habsburg problems. A dynasty could grow through weddings until it ruled places that did not speak the same language, pay taxes the same way, obey the same institutions, or imagine power in the same terms. The gift was also the trap. The Habsburgs would inherit crowns. They would also inherit frontiers, debts, rebellions, jealous kings, and wars they had not personally started, but now had to fight. In 1477, that future was not yet fully visible. The candles still burned, the parchment still held its shape. Mary and Maximilian stood at the beginning of a story neither of them could control. Around them, Burgundy trembled between France and the Empire. Beyond them, Austria waited. Spain waited. Bohemia and Hungary waited. The map of Europe, still pretending to be stable, had already begun to loosen under the pressure of dynastic blood. Before we go deeper into that story, remember this. The Habsburgs did not rise because they were always the strongest family in Europe. They rose because they understood that strength could be written, witnessed, inherited, and sealed. If you want more stories like this, where history is not treated as a list of deads, but as the autopsy of power, subscribe and follow the next chapter. Because to understand how a wedding in Ghent could change Europe, we have to go back to a much smaller place. Not a palace, not Vienna, not Madrid, not the imperial court, but a lonely hill in Aargau, where a small castle gave a family its name, long before anyone could imagine that one day that name would sit on half the thrones of Europe. Before the Habsburgs became emperors, they were a name attached to stone. Not marble halls in Vienna, not Spanish palaces looking west toward the Atlantic, not the crowded courts of Burgundy where silk, money, and ambition moved through the air like perfume. Just a castle on a hill. In the region of Aargau, in what is now northern Switzerland, a fortress rose above the landscape sometime around the early 11th century. Later tradition associated it with Count Radbot and with the early family network that would give the Habsburgs their name. The exact beginnings are not as clean as dynastic legends prefer. Medieval origins rarely are. Some stories would later search for meaning in the name itself, the hawk, the ford, the height, the place, as if the future of a dynasty must already be hidden in the first syllable. But at the beginning, there was no visible destiny. There was land. There were roads, rivers, abbeys, fields, tolls, forests, and local rivalries. There were families trying to secure rights before another family secured them first. There were monks copying charters, tenants paying dues, stewards watching harvests, and armed men reminding the countryside that law in the Middle Ages often needed a wall behind it. The Habsburg story begins there, not in grandeur, but in accumulation. A castle did not make a family great by itself. A castle was a claim made visible. It told neighbors that someone intended to stay. It watched the roads. It protected interests. It threatened competitors. It gave a name, a place to cling to. From the outside, Habsburg Castle was not the beginning of a world power. It was one more fortified seat in a landscape full of lords who expected their descendants to matter. Most of them did not. That is what makes the beginning so easy to misunderstand. When later generations look backward, they tend to turn origin into prophecy. A small castle becomes the seed of an empire. A local count becomes the first shadow of kings. Every stone looks meaningful, because the ending is already known. But no peasant walking below that hill in the 11th century could have guessed that the name above him would one day be connected to Austria, Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary, and the imperial crown. To him, the castle was not Europe's future. It was a practical fact, a place where dues were counted, disputes were settled, commands came down, and men with weapons could appear if obedience failed. Imagine a morning in that landscape, mist still caught in the low ground, hooves pressing into damp earth, smoke rising from hearths before the sun fully reached the fields. Somewhere near an abbey, a bell marked the hour. A steward might sit with a record of obligations, grain owed, labour owed, a right confirmed by memory or parchment. The people below the castle did not live inside a grand historical thesis. They lived inside a network of duties. That was how lordship felt at ground level. Not destiny, obligation. For the early Habsburgs, these obligations mattered more than heroic legend. They built influence the way many regional noble families did, through landholding, kinship, ecclesiastical ties, patronage, protection, and patient advantage. A marriage here, a right there, a relationship with a monastery. A claim recognized by a neighbor because resisting it cost more than accepting it. Small gains hardened into expectation. Expectation, if it lasted long enough, became status. And status was the first currency of medieval power. It is tempting to rush from this castle to the imperial throne, because the later story is so much louder. But the slow beginning explains the dynasty better than the later crowns do. The Habsburgs did not begin as conquerors bursting across Europe. They began as local actors in a fragmented world, learning a lesson that would stay with them for centuries. Power was not always seized in one dramatic moment. Often it was assembled piece by piece, until no one could remember when the assembly had begun. That lesson fit the political world around them. The Holy Roman Empire was not a single centralized state in the modern sense. It was a layered order of kingship, duchies, counties, bishoprics, abbeys, free cities, family rights, feudal obligations, and regional loyalties. Authority did not move in one straight line from emperor to subject. It passed through titles, privileges, local custom, church institutions, and noble consent. In such a world, a family did not need to conquer everything at once. It needed to place itself inside enough relationships that its presence became difficult to remove. This was the soil in which the Habsburg method first grew. Long before they mastered great marriages, they practiced smaller forms of connection. Blood tied houses together, land tied people to families, charters tied memory to law. Religious patronage tied noble ambition to spiritual respectability. A family that looked modest on a map could become useful, then necessary, then difficult to ignore. The castle gave them a name, the region gave them a base, but the system around them gave them an education. It taught them that politics was not only the art of victory, it was the art of being recognized. A claim had to be seen, a title had to be acknowledged. A marriage had to be witnessed. A document had to survive. A family had to make its rights appear older, deeper and more natural than the ambitions of its rivals. This is why the Habsburg rise cannot be understood as a miracle. Miracles are too clean. Their ascent was built from the dirtier materials of medieval politics: property, memory, pressure, opportunism, loyalty, and luck. Luck mattered, A death at the right moment could open land. A marriage arranged for ordinary reasons could become extraordinary because an heir failed elsewhere. A ruler's weakness could make a lesser noble suddenly valuable. A regional family could be lifted upward not because everyone loved it, but because greater powers feared one another more. That last point would become decisive. For centuries, the Habsburgs remained only one family among many in the German-speaking lands. They had influence, but not inevitability. They had castles, rights, and connections, but not the aura of a house born to rule Europe. Their story could have stayed regional. It could have ended as one more noble line swallowed by marriages, partitions, debt, or a stronger neighbor. Many families did. The medieval world was full of names that once mattered, and then became footnotes in someone else's inheritance. The Habsburgs survived that danger because they learned how to turn modest strength into strategic usefulness. They were not yet strong enough to dominate the empire. That weakness would later make them attractive. They were not yet rich enough to terrify every prince. That made them electable. They were not yet attached to one overwhelming royal tradition. That made them flexible. In politics, being underestimated can be a form of protection. The first Habsburgs could not have planned the full future of the dynasty. No one in a hill castle in Aargau was designing the inheritance of Spain or the rivalry with France. But they did create the conditions that allowed later generations to move. They had a name. They had land. They had habits of accumulation. They had learned to survive in a political order where legitimacy was made from many small recognitions rather than one single command. Then came the crisis that would change everything. The empire entered a period of instability. Great princes watched one another with suspicion. The German crown could not simply pass like private property from father to son. It had to be chosen, accepted, negotiated, and defended. The most powerful candidates could look too dangerous. The weakest could look useless. The electors needed someone who might restore order without turning the crown into a weapon against them. And in that moment, a family from Aargau became useful in a much larger game. The castle that should have remained a local memory had produced something more valuable than grandeur. It had produced a candidate. In 1273, the princes of the Holy Roman Empire would look toward Rudolf of Habsburg, a man powerful enough to matter, but not so powerful that they believed he could master them. They thought they were choosing a king they could manage. They were also opening the door to a dynasty that would spend the next centuries proving how dangerous a patient family could be. The princes of the empire did not gather in 1273 because they wanted a legend. They wanted control. The Holy Roman Empire had spent too long in uncertainty. The throne had become a question no one could answer without also asking who would benefit from the answer. Kings had come and gone. Claims had overlapped. Great families had watched one another with suspicion. Cities wanted order. Bishops wanted protection. Princes wanted a ruler strong enough to keep the roads from falling into disorder, but not so strong that he could turn that order against them. That was the delicate hunger of the empire. It needed a king. It feared a master. To understand why Rudolf of Habsburg mattered, we have to forget the modern idea of a kingdom moving smoothly from father to son. The German crown was not simple inheritance. It was not a private possession that could be locked in a chest and handed to the next generation. It was elective, negotiated, conditional, and dangerous. A king of the Romans had to be chosen by powerful men whose own authority depended on making sure the king remained dependent on them. The crown was not only a prize, it was a contract written in suspicion. For years before Rudolf's election, the empire had lived through the instability often called the Great Interregnum. The phrase sounds clean, almost administrative, but its reality was less elegant. In a fragmented political world, imperial weakness meant contested rights, insecure roads, noble feuds, toll disputes, uncertain justice, and local powers learning that the absence of a strong center could be profitable. Some benefited from disorder. Many endured it. A merchant moving goods through the Rhineland did not experience imperial politics as a theory. He experienced it as tolls at river crossings, armed escorts, damaged roads, and the risk that one lord's promise of safe passage might mean nothing once the cart entered another lord's territory. A monastery might preserve an old privilege in its archive, but parchment did not collect itself into soldiers. A town council could appeal to law, but law needed someone recognized enough to enforce it. So when the electors turned to Rudolf of Habsburg in 1273, they were making a calculation. Rudolf was not nobody. That would have made him useless. He had lands, experience, military credibility, and noble standing. But he was not a king of France. He was not the ruler of a vast, compact monarchy with deep resources and a natural claim to dominate the princes. He was a regional nobleman from the southwest, a count with enough weight to be useful and enough limits to seem manageable. That was his attraction. And that was the mistake. The men who choose compromise candidates often assume compromise is a permanent condition. They see the candidate as he stands in that moment, constrained, dependent, grateful, surrounded by stronger men. What they cannot always see is what office itself can do to a man, and what a patient family can do with even a temporary opening. Rudolf's election did not instantly transform the Habsburgs into Europe's ruling house. It did something more subtle and more important. It gave them entry into the highest language of legitimacy available in the empire. From that point forward, they were no longer merely a noble family with castles, rights, and regional claims. They had touched kingship. They had stood inside the machinery of imperial recognition. That mattered because medieval power was never only material. A nobleman could own land, command retainers, collect dues, and still remain limited by rank. A king could be poor, contested, or frustrated, but the title placed him in a different political atmosphere. People spoke differently around kings. Documents moved differently in their names. Enemies had to oppose them with more careful language. Ambition, once crowned, became harder to dismiss as mere appetite. Rudolf understood the opportunity. He also understood its danger. The electors had not chosen him so that he could build an unstoppable family monarchy. They had chosen him to restore order while leaving their own privileges intact. If he pushed too fast, they would resist him. If he remained only their servant, the Habsburg moment would vanish. His task was to use a crown that was not hereditary, to create advantages that could be inherited. This was the central political puzzle of his reign. The empire could elect a king. But the king had children. A messenger carrying news of Rudolf's election would not have known he was carrying the beginning of a dynastic transformation. He would have ridden through wet roads, market towns, church lands, and noble territories, where the imperial name still mattered, but did not always command obedience. In one town, the news might have been received with relief, Perhaps tolls would be regularized, disputes judged, feuds restrained. In another, with caution. A new king meant new demands, new confirmations, new chances for old rights to be challenged. The horse would tire before the politics did. At ground level, kingship arrived as rumour first, then as letters, then as officials, then as requests for recognition, service, money, or military support. For ordinary people, the new reign became real not when Rudolf was praised in a hall, but when someone came to collect, enforce, register, or command. That was the distance between ceremony and power. Rudolf had to cross that distance. He moved carefully through the old logic of the empire. He presented himself not as a destroyer of princely rights, but as a restorer of order. This mattered. A king who looked like a conqueror could unite the princes against him. A king who looked like a judge could claim to be repairing the world they all depended on. But restoration had teeth. If the crown was to mean anything, it had to recover lands and rights that had drifted into powerful hands during the years of weakness. The most important of these hands belonged to one of the most formidable rulers in Central Europe, Przemysl Ottokar II, King of Bohemia. Ottokar was everything Rudolf was not supposed to be. He was glamorous, wealthy, territorially ambitious, and dangerous. Through force, inheritance, marriage, and opportunity, he had gathered a powerful block of lands, including Austria and Styria. His position made him more than a regional prince. It made him the kind of ruler who could dominate the empire from the east if left unchecked. For Rudolf, Ottokar was a rival. For the electors, he was a warning. This is where Rudolf's election began to reveal its deeper logic. The princes had chosen him partly because they did not want an overmighty king. But once chosen, Rudolf could use their fear of overmighty princes to strengthen the crown. Ottokar's power gave Rudolf a mission that looked legitimate. Recover imperial lands, discipline a prince who had become too large, and restore the balance that imperial authority claimed to protect. It was a brilliant political position. Rudolf did not need to say, at least not openly, that he wanted Austria for his family. He could say he was defending the rights of the empire. He could speak as king, not as a hungry count. That is how ambition survives in public. It dresses itself in duty. But beneath the language of order, the Habsburg future was beginning to sharpen. The family from Aargau had gained a crown, but not yet the land base required to make that crown matter across generations. If Rudolf died with only prestige, the moment might pass. His sons would inherit memories, not power. The Habsburgs needed something more durable than election. They needed a territory rich enough, central enough, and prestigious enough to anchor the family long after the princes had chosen another king. Austria was that territory. This is the part of the story where the wedding strategy has not yet fully appeared, but its logic is already forming. The Habsburgs were learning the same lesson in another form. A title without material foundation is fragile. A claim without land evaporates. A crown that cannot be passed down must be converted into something that can. Rudolf's kingship was therefore not an end, it was leverage. And the leverage pointed east, toward Austria, toward Ottokar, toward a confrontation that would prove the Habsburgs were not pacifists, not dreamers, not harmless marriage brokers floating above medieval violence. Before they became famous for winning through inheritance, they had to win the land that made inheritance worth anything. The electors thought they had chosen a useful man. Rudolf intended to become a useful king. But his family needed him to become something more dangerous, the founder of a territorial future. The next chapter begins where the political calculation turns into open conflict. On the road to Austria, where law would need an army, and a king chosen for balance would discover that balance could be used as a weapon. A crown could lift a man above other nobles. It could surround him with ceremony, bend knees before him, and make scribes write his name in a different ink. But a crown could not feed his sons after he was gone. For Rudolf of Habsburg, this was the problem hidden inside the triumph of 1273. He had become king of the Romans, but kingship in the Holy Roman Empire was not a family estate. It did not automatically pass to his children. It depended on election, negotiation, recognition, and the goodwill, or fear, of princes who had no desire to see the German crown become hereditary in Habsburg hands. Rudolf had reached the summit. Now he had to make sure his family did not fall from it the moment he died. That meant land, not scattered rights, not fragile prestige, not the memory of a lucky election. He needed a territorial foundation large enough to survive him, rich enough to sustain his heirs, and central enough to make the Habsburg name permanent in imperial politics. Austria was the answer. In the late 13th century, Austria was not simply a region on a map. It was a prize of roads, rivers, towns, fortresses, ducal dignity, and strategic position. It stood between German lands, Bohemia, Hungary, Italy, and the Danube world. Whoever controlled Austria did not merely own territory, he held a hinge in Central Europe. And that hinge was in the hands of Premisil Ottokar II, King of Bohemia. Ottokar was no minor rebel waiting to be disciplined by a new king. He was one of the most powerful rulers in the empire's orbit, a man whose territories had stretched his influence across Bohemia, Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and beyond. To his supporters, he looked like a builder of order. To his enemies, he looked like a prince who had grown too large for the balance of the empire. For Rudolf, Ottokar was both obstacle and opportunity. The official issue was law. During the years of imperial weakness, certain lands and rights had been taken, held, or claimed in ways that a restored king could now question. Rudolf could present himself as the defender of imperial order, demanding that Ottokar submit, recognize royal authority, and restore what had been improperly held. But behind the legal language stood a harsher truth. If Rudolf could break Ottokar's hold on Austria, the Habsburgs might gain the one thing they lacked: a home worthy of a dynasty. This was not yet the famous Habsburg method of marriage inheritance. This was older, rougher, and more dangerous. It was the medieval mixture of law and force, where a document could justify a campaign, but soldiers still had to cross the fields. Rudolf did not move only as a private rival. That would have made his ambition too naked. He moved as king. He summoned, judged, demanded, and framed the conflict as a matter of imperial rights. In 1276, Ottokar was forced to yield Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola under pressure, accepting Rudolf's authority in a settlement that looked like submission. But men who have built great power do not easily accept humiliation. Ottokar had not merely lost lands, he had lost face. He had been made to bow before a man he may have considered socially and politically beneath him. Rudolf had the crown, but Ottokar had the memory of grandeur. That memory could still raise armies. The conflict did not end in 1276. It waited. Like many political settlements of the Middle Ages, it was less a conclusion than a pause between acts of violence. In 1278, the dispute reached its brutal test on the Markfeld, near Dürnkrout and Jedenspeigen, northeast of Vienna. The battlefield lay in the open lands where cavalry, alliances, exhaustion, and timing could decide what legal arguments alone could not. Rudolf stood with allies, including Hungarian support. Ottokar came to reclaim what he had lost, or at least to reverse the humiliation that had been forced upon him. The details of medieval battles often come down to us through accounts shaped by memory, loyalty, and later explanation. We should be cautious with perfect tactical certainty, but the outcome is not uncertain. Ottokar was defeated, and he died. The death of a rival on a battlefield can simplify politics with terrifying speed. One day, a king of Bohemia stands as the greatest obstacle to Habsburg expansion. The next, his body becomes part of the argument for a new order. The lands he had held could now be reorganized through the authority of the victor. Not only because Rudolf had won with force, but because he had prepared the language of legality before the fighting began. That combination mattered. A battlefield victory without legitimacy can look like robbery. A legal claim without military force can remain ink. Rudolf brought the two together. On the ground, the change would not have felt like a clean turning of the page. Imagine an Austrian town official opening a chest of records after news of Markfeld. Inside were old seals, dues, charters, obligations, privileges, and letters tied to previous authority. The names had to be updated. Allegiance had to be expressed in the proper language. Local elites had to decide how quickly they would adapt to the new reality. No one needed to love the Habsburgs immediately. They needed to recognize that the wind had changed. A clerk scraping wax from a reused document. A burgher calculating whether trade would be safer under the new duke. A monastery checking whether its privileges would be confirmed. These were the quiet scenes by which conquest became government. War made the opening. Administration made it last. Rudolf's next challenge was to ensure that Austria did not simply become another temporary royal possession. He had not fought Ottokar merely to restore abstract imperial order. He wanted the future of his house fixed into the soil. In 1282, Rudolf invested his sons, Albert and Rudolf, with Austria and Styria. This was the turning point. Not because it was more dramatic than Markfeld. It was not. No battlefield thunder, no dead king, no broken cavalry line. But dynasties are often built in the quieter moments after violence, when the winners decide what the victory was really for. With that act, Rudolf converted royal opportunity into family territory. The Habsburgs were no longer merely counts from Aargau who had reached the German throne. They were now tied to Austria in a way that would reshape their identity for centuries. Over time, the phrase House of Austria would become inseparable from the Habsburg name. Vienna would rise in importance. The Danube would matter more than the old Swiss homeland. The family's future shifted east. There is a strange irony here. The Habsburgs, who would later be remembered for gaining lands through marriage, first secured their greatest foundation through a combination of election, legal pressure, war, and dynastic settlement. Austria was not a wedding gift. It was a prize taken from a rival, then made inheritable. That is why the simple version of the Habsburg legend is misleading. They did not replace violence with marriage. They learned how to make every form of power serve inheritance. When war was necessary, they fought. When law was useful, they used it. When a title could raise their status, they claimed it. When a marriage could carry land farther than an army, they arranged it. The genius was not softness, it was conversion, turning one kind of advantage into another, then passing it to the next generation. Austria became the workshop of that conversion. It gave the family a base large enough to outlive failed elections and lost campaigns. It gave them resources, prestige, and a Central European position. It made them harder to dismiss. A Habsburg without Austria could have been remembered as a lucky count who briefly wore the German crown. A Habsburg with Austria became a permanent fact in imperial politics. But permanence had a cost. Austria tied the dynasty to new obligations. It required governance, defense, negotiation with local elites, management of towns and estates, and the constant maintenance of ducal authority. A territory was not a jewel placed inside a crown. It was a living structure of people, revenues, roads, privileges, resentments, and expectations. The more the Habsburgs gained, the more they had to hold. This would become the pattern of their history. At first, each acquisition looked like rescue from weakness. Austria rescued them from the fragility of election. Burgundy would rescue them from regional limitation. Spain would rescue them from continental scale and lift them into global monarchy. Bohemia and Hungary would rescue them from being merely Austrian and place them at the edge of the Ottoman world. But each rescue brought a new burden. Rudolf could not see all of that from the late 13th century. What he could see was simpler and more urgent. His kingship would end. His sons would need land. His family needed a future that no elector could easily take away. Austria gave him that. And yet, even after this achievement, Rudolf's deeper ambition remained unfinished. He had given the Habsburgs a territorial heart, but he had not made the imperial crown hereditary. The princes of the empire still guarded their right to choose. The same system that elevated Rudolf could abandon his heirs. The crown had opened the door. Austria had given the family a house beyond the door. But a house is not an empire. After Rudolf, the Habsburgs would discover that turning royal success into dynastic permanence was far more dangerous than winning a single battle. The enemy would not always be a rival king like Ottokar. Sometimes it would be the structure of the empire itself. Sometimes it would be the suspicion of princes. And sometimes, most painfully, it would come from inside the family. The next chapter follows that darker lesson. The moment when the Habsburgs tried to make the crown behave like property, and learned that both the empire and blood relatives could resist with violence. The most dangerous illusion in a dynasty is the belief that yesterday's victory belongs automatically to tomorrow's heir. Rudolf of Habsburg had given his family Austria. That alone was a triumph large enough to change their future. He had taken a house once rooted in Aargau and fastened it to one of the most important territories in Central Europe. His sons would not inherit only a name. They would inherit land, revenues, castles, rights, and the beginnings of a political identity that could survive beyond one reign. But Rudolf had not solved the greater problem. He had worn the German crown. He had not made it Habsburg property. When Rudolf died in 1291, the limits of his achievement became visible almost immediately. The electors did not simply hand the kingship to his son Albert. That was not how the empire was meant to work, and more importantly, that was not how the princes wanted it to work. A king could try to build a family future. The electors could interrupt it. They chose Adolf of Nassau. The decision was not merely personal, it was structural. The princes of the Holy Roman Empire had no interest in rewarding Rudolf's success by allowing his family to turn election into inheritance. The Habsburgs had gained Austria. That was already enough to make them more dangerous than they had been before. To give them the crown again, too easily, too quickly, would be to admit that Rudolf had changed the rules. And the princes guarded the rules because the rules guarded them. For Albert of Habsburg, this was humiliation wrapped in procedure. He was Rudolf's son. He was Duke of Austria. He was the natural heir in the eyes of family ambition. But in the empire, blood alone did not command obedience. Rank had to be recognized. Recognition had to be negotiated. And negotiation could be used as a knife. Albert waited. He did not disappear. That is important. The early Habsburgs were not only opportunists, they were survivors of delay. Their ambitions could be blocked, but not easily erased. Albert held Austria, watched Adolf's reign, measured dissatisfaction among the princes, and waited for the political weather to change. It did. Adolf of Nassau gradually alienated important forces within the empire. His attempts to build his own power base, especially through territorial ambitions in Thuringia and Meissen, made him look less like a useful compromise and more like another king trying to turn office into patrimony. The same fear that had once worked against Albert began to work against Adolf. This was the cruel balance of imperial politics. The princes wanted a king strong enough to be useful. But the moment he used strength for himself, they remembered why they feared kings. In 1298, Albert challenged Adolf. The conflict led to the Battle of Gohlheim, where Adolf was defeated and killed. Albert then secured election as King of the Romans. At last, Rudolf's son had reached the throne his father had occupied. But he reached it through blood, not inheritance. That distinction mattered. Albert did not receive the crown as a son receiving a family estate. He had to fight for the opportunity to be elected. His kingship began with the memory of resistance, and that memory shaped everything that followed. He understood better than most men that the German crown was powerful enough to tempt a dynasty, but unstable enough to punish one. Still, ambition does not vanish because the rules are difficult. Albert's reign was marked by the same central tension that had defined Rudolf's achievement. How could a Habsburg king use a non-hereditary crown to strengthen a hereditary family? Austria gave him a base. The royal title gave him reach. But between the two stood the suspicious architecture of the empire. Princes, bishops, cities, rival houses, legal customs, and the old fear that one family might become too large for everyone else's safety. Albert pushed where he could. He sought to consolidate Habsburg authority, defend family interests, and expand influence through imperial office. He was not a reckless dreamer. He understood law, pressure, timing, and the cold language of advantage. But the more a Habsburg king tried to bind office to bloodline, the more he reminded the princes why they had resisted the family after Rudolf's death. The crown did not want to become property. Neither did the family always behave like a machine of loyalty. Inside the Habsburg world, inheritance could wound as deeply as war. The lands Rudolf had secured created opportunity, but they also created expectations among sons, nephews, cousins, and claimants who believed they were owed a share of the family's rise. A dynasty is not one will moving cleanly through time. It is a crowded house. Every grant creates disappointment somewhere. Every inheritance leaves someone measuring what he did not receive. Among those disappointed figures was John, later remembered as John Parricida. He was Albert's nephew, the son of Rudolf II. His grievance centered on inheritance and family rights, though the precise emotional shape of that grievance cannot be recovered with certainty. Later writers sharpened the story, as later writers often do when blood enters a royal house. What matters is the political pattern. The same dynastic accumulation that made Habsburg power possible also made family conflict more dangerous. When land becomes destiny, every excluded relative becomes a threat. Imagine a corridor in a Habsburg residence in the years before 1308. A guard hears names spoken in low voices. Albert, John, Austria, inheritance, rights. He does not need to understand every legal detail. Men who serve near power learn the sound of grievance before they know its full cause. A door shuts. A messenger arrives. A request is delayed. A promise is remembered differently by the man who made it and the man who expected it. There is no need to invent a secret conversation. The structure itself was dangerous enough. In May 1308, near the Reuss River close to Windisch, Albert was assassinated by John and his accomplices. The king was separated from much of his retinue while crossing the river area, and the attack came from within the broader family circle. A Habsburg ruler who had fought his way to the German crown did not fall before a foreign king. He fell to a grievance carried by blood. The shock was not only personal, it was symbolic. Albert's death exposed the fragility of a dynasty still trying to turn opportunity into permanence. Rudolf had gained Austria. Albert had regained the crown. But neither achievement had created a stable formula for succession, family unity, and imperial acceptance. The Habsburgs possessed land, ambition, and royal memory. They did not yet possess a reliable system for making all of it move in one direction. The murder also showed the difference between a family and a state. A state can punish betrayal as treason. A family feels betrayal as injury before it can define it as crime. In a dynasty, the two become entangled. The assassin is not only an enemy, he is kin. The wound is political, legal, emotional, and ceremonial all at once. For the Habsburgs, Albert's assassination did not destroy the house. They were too rooted by then to disappear. Austria remained. The family name remained. The memory of kingship remained. But the German crown slipped away again, and the lesson was brutal. A throne won once, or even twice, was not yet a dynasty's possession. The electors would continue to choose. The princes would continue to resist. The family would continue to divide, argue, and remember grievances. This is where the Habsburg story becomes darker than the simple legend of fortunate marriages. Before they became famous for inheriting Europe through brides and children, they had to survive the uglier school of dynastic politics, the knowledge that bloodline could create claims, but claims could create hatred. Albert's reign had carried the hope that Rudolf's achievement might become a pattern. His death revealed that the pattern was still unstable. Habsburg power was growing, but it was not yet elegant. It was a house learning to walk across a floor full of knives. imperial elections, princely suspicion, territorial ambition, and family resentment. What would they do after such a lesson? They could retreat into Austria and accept the limits of a ducal future. They could wait for another opening. Or they could try again to seize the German crown through force. The next generation chose the harder road. In the early 14th century, Habsburg ambition would return to the battlefield. Frederick the Fair would contest the kingship against Louis of Bavaria. Meanwhile, in the mountains of the old Swiss homeland, Habsburg arms would face a different kind of enemy. Not a glamorous king like Ottokar, not a rival prince, but communities that refused to behave as obedient subjects. The dynasty had won Austria with war and law. Now it would learn how war could humiliate even those who believed they were born to command. The mountains did not care about noble blood. They did not care about banners, titles, polished armor, or the old confidence of mounted men who believed that rank and steel could solve what politics had made difficult. In the narrow spaces of the Alpine world, power behaved differently. A lord could own rights on parchment, a duke could claim obedience. A family could remember that the lands around the old Habsburg homeland had once answered to them more easily. But stone, fog, steep paths and angry communities had their own language. And in 1315, at Morgarten, the Habsburgs were forced to hear it. The defeat at Morgarten has often been wrapped in the memory of Swiss freedom, and like many medieval battles, its details have been sharpened by later tradition. The numbers are uncertain. The drama grew in retelling. But the consequence was clear enough. Habsburg authority in the old Swiss regions could be resisted, and the resistance could win. That mattered because it wounded more than military pride. It wounded geography. The Habsburgs were no longer only the family of Aargau. Since Rudolf I, their future had been shifting eastward toward Austria. Yet the ancestral region still carried emotional and strategic meaning. To lose control there, or to be humiliated there, was to feel the past slipping away while the future remained unfinished. The man associated with the Habsburg effort at Morgarten was Leopold I of Austria, a member of the family now ruling from the Austrian base Rudolf had secured. He faced communities connected with the early Swiss Confederation, especially Schwyz, whose conflicts with Habsburg power had grown out of rights, privileges, local autonomy, and the hard question of who had the authority to command mountain people who had learned to value their own forms of freedom. This was not simply a romantic struggle between peasants and tyrants. The real history was messier. There were legal claims, imperial privileges, local interests, noble pressures and shifting alliances. But messiness does not make the lesson weaker. For the Habsburgs, Morgarten revealed that lordship written in documents did not automatically become obedience in the hills. To rule a place, one had to do more than possess a claim. One had to make the claim function in terrain, in local custom, in memory, in fear, and in everyday consent. On paper, the Habsburgs could point to rights. In the pass, paper became very thin. Imagine a Habsburg retainer before the march into the mountains. Wet wool under armor, leather straps darkened by rain, a horse uneasy on broken ground. He might not know the full legal dispute. He might only know that his lord had ordered him forward, and that the path ahead seemed narrower than a battlefield should be. In open country, cavalry had confidence. In the mountains, confidence had edges. A stone falling from above does not ask whether a man is noble. The defeat did not destroy the Habsburgs. Austria remained their foundation. Their ambitions remained larger than the Swiss valleys. But Morgarten became part of a pattern. The sword could fail where local conditions, terrain, and communal resistance made aristocratic force clumsy. It was a warning from the family's old landscape. Another warning came from the center of imperial politics. After Albert I's assassination in 1308, the Habsburgs did not regain the German crown immediately. The empire continued its familiar game of election, rivalry, and suspicion. In 1314, that game produced a crisis. Two kings were chosen. Frederick the Fair of Habsburg was elected by one group of princes, while Louis of Bavaria was elected by another. The crown had become divided by recognition itself. This was more than a contest between two men. It was a reminder that in the Holy Roman Empire, legitimacy did not come from a single source. If enough powerful people refused to agree, even kingship could split into rival versions of truth. Frederick could call himself king. Louis could do the same. Each claim required allies, money, soldiers, documents, oaths, and time. And time is expensive. For the Habsburgs, Frederick's claim was a chance to restore the royal dignity that had slipped after Albert's death. The family had Austria. It had memory. It had ambition. It had already learned that a crown could not simply be inherited, but perhaps it could still be won through alliance and force. The struggle dragged the dynasty deeper into the costs of war. War in the Middle Ages was not only the clash itself, it was everything before and after it. Horses fed, armor repaired, messengers sent, debts incurred, castles supplied, allies rewarded, peasants taxed, fields disturbed, and local men pulled toward causes that belonged to princes more than to villages. Somewhere in Austria, a family might hear that another horse was needed, another payment expected, another son drawn into service. The German crown was far away from the household fire, but the cost of the crown could enter through the door with a collector, a noble command, or a rumor that the Duke's war required more than loyalty this year. That is where dynastic ambition becomes visible to ordinary people. Not in the ceremony, in the demand. Frederick the Fair and Louis of Bavaria moved through years of conflict until the matter came to a decisive military test at Mühldorf in 1322. Again, the details of medieval battle should be handled with care. Later accounts often prefer clarity to complexity. But the outcome is firm. Frederick was defeated and captured. For Habsburg ambition, it was a bitter reversal. The family that had once watched Rudolf I rise through election now saw another Habsburg claimant fall through war. Frederick's defeat did not erase Austria. It did not erase the family's rank. But it postponed the dream of turning Habsburg prestige into stable imperial control. The crown remained beyond reach, not because the family lacked desire, but because desire kept meeting structures stronger than itself. At Morgarten, the sword failed against mountain resistance. At Mühldorf, it failed against a rival king. Together, these defeats did something important to the Habsburg imagination. They did not make the dynasty peaceful. They did not turn the family away from war forever. But they made clear that battle alone was an unreliable architect. It could decide a day. It could destroy a man. It could humiliate a house. But it could not guarantee that a crown would remain in the family, or that local communities would obey simply because a duke expected them to. This was the hard education of the 14th century. The Habsburgs were powerful enough to be feared, but not powerful enough to command the whole system. They were prestigious enough to contest kingship, but not prestigious enough to own it. They were rooted in Austria, yet vulnerable in the lands of their origin. They had learned to use force, and force had taught them its limits. A lesser dynasty might have broken under that contradiction. The Habsburgs adapted. The adaptation was not immediate, and it was not elegant at first. The family continued to fight, negotiate, divide lands among branches, and struggle with rivals. But gradually, the center of Habsburg strategy shifted towards something deeper than battlefield success. If the empire would not reliably give them the crown, they needed stronger territorial dignity. If the electors could exclude them, they needed a language of rank that did not depend entirely on the electors. If war could fail, documents might wait longer than armies. This is the quiet bridge from Frederick's defeat to Rudolf IV's ambition. The next great Habsburg answer would not come from a charge of horsemen. It would come from parchment. But before that answer appeared, another ruler shaped the rules of the empire in a way that humiliated the Habsburgs without drawing a sword against them. In 1356, Emperor Charles IV issued the Golden Bull, one of the most important constitutional documents of the Holy Roman Empire. It clarified the rights of the prince-electors and fixed the structure of imperial election with a force that would last for centuries. And the Habsburgs were not among the electors. That exclusion cut deeply. After Rudolf I, after Austria, after Albert, after Frederick's failed bid, after decades of struggle, the family could see in writing what the empire still refused to grant them: a secure place at the highest table of imperial choice. The Golden Bull made order. But for the Habsburgs, that order looked like a ceiling. A ceiling can do two things to an ambitious house. It can stop it, or it can teach it to forge a ladder. The next chapter enters one of the strangest and most revealing moments in Habsburg history. A duke in Vienna, a wounded family pride, and a set of documents so ambitious that they tried to rewrite the rank of Austria itself. When the sword failed, the archive was waiting. A battlefield can humiliate a dynasty in a single day. A document can humiliate it for generations. In 1356, Emperor Charles IV issued the Golden Bull, one of the defining constitutional texts of the Holy Roman Empire. It did not look like an act of violence. There was no cavalry charge, no dead duke in the mud, no mountain pass echoing with panic. It was law, order, procedure. A careful arrangement of who had the right to choose the King of the Romans and how that choice would be made. But for the Habsburgs, the wound was unmistakable. The Golden Bull confirmed the special status of 7 prince-electors: the archbishops of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne, the King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony, and the Margrave of Brandenburg. These were the men and offices whose votes stood at the formal center of imperial election. Austria was not there. The Habsburgs were not there. After Rudolf I had worn the crown, after Austria had become the family's territorial heart, after Albert I had fought his way to kingship, after Frederick the Fair had spilled resources in a failed contest for the throne, the message was coldly written into the empire's structure. Habsburg greatness remained real, but incomplete. They had rank, they had land. They did not have a vote at the highest table. For Charles IV of Luxembourg, the Golden Bull was not written simply to insult the Habsburgs. It was an attempt to stabilize a political order that had too often fractured around disputed elections. The empire needed rules. It needed clarity. It needed a mechanism strong enough to prevent every succession from becoming a civil war of titles, oaths, and armies. Charles understood the value of legal architecture. He built power not only through armies and marriages, but through institutions, privileges, cities, and ceremony. Prague under his rule became a dazzling political stage. The empire under his pen acquired a clearer electoral skeleton. But every structure includes someone and excludes someone else. For Vienna, exclusion had a taste. It tasted like lowered rank. The Habsburg answer came from Rudolf IV of Austria, later remembered as the Founder. The nickname can sound generous, even noble, and in some ways it fits. Rudolf IV understood that a dynasty needed more than armies. It needed a city, a university, a cathedral, titles, documents, and the confidence to make ambition look ancient. But his most revealing act was not carved first in stone. It was written on parchment. Around 1358 and 1359, under Rudolf IV's authority, a set of documents appeared that would become known as the Privilegium Maius. These texts claimed extraordinary privileges for Austria and its rulers, elevating the status of the Habsburg dukes far above ordinary ducal rank. They presented Austria as a uniquely privileged territory, with rights supposedly reaching back into deep imperial history. The problem was simple. They were forged. Not forged in the crude sense of a lazy lie scratched by an amateur hand, but forged as an act of political imagination. The Privilegium Maius was an attempt to manufacture antiquity for ambition. It answered the Golden Bull not by overturning it directly, but by creating an alternate ladder of dignity. If the Habsburgs could not be prince-electors, Austria could be made to look like something older, higher, more special, a territory whose ruler deserved a rank approaching royalty. Here the Habsburg story enters one of its most revealing rooms. Not a battlefield, not a wedding chamber, a chancery. Picture a scribe under candle smoke, scraping, copying, shaping formulae in a language of solemn authority. The room is small compared with the dream inside it. On the table lie parchment, ink, knives, seals, and precedents, real or invented. Outside, Vienna is not yet the unquestioned capital of a world power. Inside, words are being arranged to make Austria appear greater than the empire's official hierarchy has allowed. A clerk's hand moves slowly because a title is never only a title. A title changes how others must speak to you. The future archducal dignity associated with the Habsburgs would grow from this kind of ambition. The term archduke itself became central to the family's self-fashioning, a way of distinguishing Austria from ordinary duchies and lifting Habsburg rank above the level that imperial procedure had assigned them. Recognition would take time. The documents were not simply accepted by everyone as immediate truth, but that is precisely why the episode matters. The Habsburgs were not only claiming what existed, they were teaching the future how to recognize what they wanted to exist. In medieval politics, authenticity mattered. So did use. So did power. So did repetition. So did whether later rulers found a claim convenient enough to confirm. A document could begin as a fiction and still shape reality if enough institutions eventually treated it as useful. This does not make the forgery honest. It makes it politically dangerous. Rudolf IV understood the theatre of legality. He had watched, or at least inherited the consequences of, a century in which Habsburg swords had not secured a permanent place in the imperial election. Morgarten had shown one limit, Mühldorf had shown another. The Golden Bull had now made exclusion official. The response could not be another reckless campaign. Austria needed dignity that did not depend on a battlefield victory. So Rudolf reached for history. Or rather, he reached for the power to write history in advance. This was not madness. It was strategy carried to the edge of fraud. A ruler in the 14th century did not live in a world where law was merely discovered like a stone in a field. Law was preserved, interpreted, confirmed, challenged, copied, and weaponized. Charters mattered because they made memory portable. A family with the right document could argue that its privilege was not ambition, but inheritance. That was the real purpose of the Privilegium Maius. It gave Habsburg desire an ancestral costume. For ordinary people in Austria, the forgery itself may have felt distant. A peasant in a village, a mason in Vienna, a merchant along the Danube, their lives were not transformed overnight because a duke claimed elevated rights. But the consequences of status traveled downward over time. Higher rank meant greater ceremonial ambition. Greater ambition required buildings, officials, taxes, confirmations, courts, and the constant performance of ducal importance. Power announced itself above. The cost of announcement often settled below. A stonecutter repairing a church wall, or a messenger carrying a sealed letter, might not know every clause of the Privilegium Maius, but he lived inside the world those clauses tried to build. A world where Austria was not merely one duchy among others, but the core of a house demanding to be treated as exceptional. This is where Rudolf IV becomes more than a forger. He becomes a diagnostician of Habsburg weakness. He saw that the family's problem was not only military, it was symbolic. The Habsburgs had territory, but not the rank they believed the territory deserved. They had a past, but not a past grand enough for their future. They had Austria, but Austria had to be made to look inevitable as the seat of a great house. The Golden Bull had created an imperial hierarchy. Rudolf IV created a counter-myth. The risk, of course, was exposure and ridicule. A false document can elevate a dynasty only if the political world has reason to tolerate its fiction. Too much weakness, and the document is laughed away. Too much force, and the document becomes unnecessary. The genius of the Habsburg position was that they occupied the middle, strong enough to insist, excluded enough to need the insistence. Their ambition had to work through paper because power had not yet become absolute. This chapter also reveals something essential about medieval legitimacy. Modern viewers often imagine forged documents as simple evidence of corruption, and they are not wrong. But in the world of dynastic politics, forgery also exposed a deeper hunger. The hunger to make power look older than it was. New power is vulnerable. Old power feels natural. If a family can persuade others that its rights stretch backward into venerable time, then its present ambitions begin to look less like aggression and more like restoration. That was what Rudolf IV wanted. Not merely advantage, antiquity. And he did not stop with parchment. A document could claim rank, but a city had to perform it. Vienna needed to look like the seat of a house too important to be ignored. It needed churches, ceremonies, learning, architecture, and public signs of greatness. If Charles IV had Prague, Rudolf IV would make Vienna speak back in stone. This is why the Privilegium Maius should not be treated as an isolated trick. It was part of a broader Habsburg transformation. After the failures of sword and election, the family began investing more heavily in the visible language of permanence. Rank would be written. Rank would be sealed. Rank would be sung in churches, taught in institutions, carved into walls, and repeated until it became difficult to imagine Austria without it. The forged ladder did not immediately place Habsburg above the electors, but it gave them something to climb. Later, Frederick III, a Habsburg himself, would confirm the Privilegium Maius, giving retrospective force to what had begun as a manufactured claim. That later confirmation is crucial. It shows how dynastic time works. One generation invents, another preserves. A later ruler, occupying higher office, turns family ambition into recognized privilege. What begins as audacity can become tradition if it survives long enough. This may be the most Habsburg lesson of all. They did not always need immediate victory. They needed claims that could wait. A forged privilege, a marriage contract, a disputed inheritance, a title no one fully accepted yet, a child not yet born, a treaty not yet activated. Again and again, Habsburg strength came from planting legal seeds in one generation and harvesting them in another. The archive was not passive. It was a battlefield with slower casualties. By the time Rudolf IV was done, Austria had not become an electorate. The Golden Bull still stood. Charles IV had not been defeated. The Habsburgs had not overturned the empire's structure. But they had answered exclusion in a language the empire understood: privilege, antiquity, ceremony, and rank. The sword had failed too often. The document could wait longer, and waiting, as the Habsburgs were beginning to prove, was a form of aggression. Yet parchment alone was not enough. A claim had to be seen. A forged dignity had to be staged in streets, churches, schools, and stone. Vienna had to become more than a ducal residence. It had to become evidence. The next chapter follows Rudolf IV from the archive into the city, to St. Stephen's Cathedral, to the founding of the University of Vienna, and to the making of a capital that could teach the world how Habsburg ambition wanted to be seen. A forged privilege could claim greatness, but stone had to make people believe it. Rudolf IV of Austria understood something that many rulers only discovered after failure. Power does not live in documents alone. A charter can declare rank, a seal can protect a title, a genealogy can stretch ambition backward into a more convenient past. But if the city around the ruler still looks ordinary, the claim remains fragile. A dynasty that wants to be treated as exceptional must make exception visible. So, after parchment, came stone. Vienna in the mid-14th century was not yet the imperial capital of later Habsburg imagination. It was important, growing, strategically placed on the Danube, and tied to the Austrian lands that had become the family's foundation. But it did not yet possess the unquestioned symbolic weight of Prague under Charles IV. It did not yet look like the natural stage of a house destined to shape Europe. Rudolf IV wanted to change that. The Privilegium Maius had tried to raise Austria's rank through the language of ancient rites. Vienna would help raise it through architecture, ritual, learning, and urban prestige. If the Habsburgs could not sit among the prince-electors, then Austria had to appear too dignified to be ignored. If imperial procedure placed a ceiling above them, Vienna would become the room in which they built upward anyway. This was not vanity alone. It was statecraft. Rulers in the medieval world did not govern only through commands. They governed through appearances that trained obedience. A cathedral spire could tell a story before a priest spoke. A university could give a city intellectual gravity. A procession through streets could remind burghers, clergy, nobles and visitors that this was not merely a place where a duke happened to reside. It was a political argument made of bells, stone, manuscripts and bodies moving in order. St. Stephen's Cathedral became central to that argument. The church had older roots, but under Rudolf IV, its expansion and symbolic elevation became tied to the Habsburg project. Gothic stone rose in Vienna, not only for worship, but for dynastic theatre. The building reached upward because the family wanted Austria's status to reach upward. Its architecture gave the city a vertical language of ambition. Towers, vaults, chapels, carved figures, and sacred space placed under the shadow of ducal self-fashioning. A man cutting stone for St. Stephen's did not need to know the full contents of the Privilegium Maius. He did not need to understand how the Golden Bull had excluded Austria from the Electoral College. His world was colder and more immediate. Dust in the throat, limestone under the chisel, wages counted, hands cracked by winter, the sound of tools striking rhythm into the air. But his labor belonged to a larger claim. Every block raised above Vienna helped the city say what Rudolf wanted the empire to hear. Austria was not ordinary. The Habsburgs were not merely another ducal house. Their authority deserved a setting grand enough to make refusal look almost unnatural. That is how architecture works in politics. It makes ambition feel like landscape. In 1365, Rudolf IV founded the University of Vienna. This act mattered as much as stone because learning had its own form of prestige. A university drew scholars, texts, clerics, legal minds, and young men seeking advancement. It gave Vienna a claim to intellectual seriousness. It placed the city into a wider European network of knowledge and status. Again, the comparison with Charles IV mattered. Prague had its own university, founded in 1348, and had become a brilliant center of imperial and cultural life under Luxembourg rule. Rudolf's Vienna was not operating in a vacuum. It was answering. It was competing. It was trying to transform Austrian dignity from a disputed claim into an urban experience. A visitor did not have to read every charter. He could see scaffolding. He could hear lectures. He could watch clergy process through a city that increasingly understood itself as the seat of something larger than local administration. This is where Rudolf IV's political imagination becomes clearer. He was not content to say that Austria was special. He tried to build conditions in which that specialness would become socially and visually plausible. The university, the cathedral, the ducal ceremonies, the title claims, all of it formed one system of representation. The Habsburgs had not yet mastered Europe through marriage. They were first learning how to master perception. At ground level, the effort had costs. Buildings required labor. Institutions required patronage. Ceremonies required money. A city remade for prestige did not float above the lives of its residents. It touched guilds, craftsmen, students, clergy, merchants, servants, and taxpayers. Ambition always leaves footprints in ordinary streets. Imagine a young student arriving in Vienna after the university's founding. His cloak damp from travel, his belongings modest, his future uncertain. He sees not an imperial capital, but a city trying to speak in a grander voice. There are church bells, narrow streets, Latin phrases, crowded rooms, candle smoke in lecture halls, and the strange feeling that knowledge itself has become part of ducal strategy. The student may want a career. The duke wants a capital. Their ambitions meet in the same room. That was Rudolf's gift and burden. He saw connections between things that less imaginative rulers might have kept separate. A church was not only a church. A university was not only a school. A title was not only a title. Each could strengthen the others if arranged properly. Austria's claim to dignity could be written in a forged privilege, spoken in ceremony, carved into sacred architecture, and taught through institutions that made Vienna harder to dismiss. Yet there was also insecurity beneath the grandeur. A ruler confident of universal recognition does not need to prove himself so intensely. Rudolf's building and claiming came from ambition, but also from wound. The Golden Bull had not merely omitted the Habsburgs, it had forced them to confront the difference between how important they felt and how important the empire officially allowed them to be. Vienna became their answer. Not an answer accepted by everyone, not an answer powerful enough to overturn imperial hierarchy overnight, but an answer that lasted. Rudolf IV died young in 1365, the same year he founded the university. His career was brief, but the direction he set was long. Later Habsburgs would continue to use Vienna as more than a residence. It would become archive, stage, symbol, and eventually center. The city would absorb the family's anxieties and project them outward through stone, ritual, bureaucracy, and memory. In that sense, Rudolf succeeded even where he overreached. The privilegium maius was false, but the need it expressed was real. The archducal claims were ambitious, but ambition repeated long enough can shape institutions. The cathedral did not make Habsburg power inevitable, but it gave that power a skyline. The university did not give Austria a vote among the electors, but it gave Vienna a voice in the educated world. This is the strange alchemy of medieval politics. A forged document seeks ancient truth. A new building pretends it has always belonged. A young dynasty teaches a city to look old enough for its future. For the people of Vienna, the transformation would have been uneven. Pride and burden rarely arrive separately. A grander city could bring scholars, merchants, prestige and opportunity. It could also bring taxes, labor demands, hierarchy, and the constant reminder that ordinary lives were being used to support dynastic theatre. A mason's chisel helped write Habsburg ambition. A student's candle helped light it. A priest's procession helped sanctify it. A merchant's payment helped fund it. The city itself became a document, harder to dismiss than parchment, because it stood in public view. And yet, even after all this, the deepest Habsburg problem remained unsolved. Vienna could look more imperial. Austria could claim higher dignity. Rudolf IV could imagine a rank greater than the empire had officially granted. But the German crowns still did not belong to the family. The electors still guarded their power. The empire still resisted becoming hereditary property. And the Habsburgs, despite Austria, despite Vienna, despite the archive and the cathedral, still had to wait for another opening. Waiting would become their discipline. In the 15th century, that discipline would take a new form in Frederick III, a ruler often mocked for caution, slowness, and lack of spectacular triumph, but whose long reign helped restore Habsburg proximity to imperial permanence. He would not look like the hero of a battlefield epic. He would look like a man willing to survive other men's impatience. And sometimes, in dynastic history, survival is not passivity. It is preparation, wearing a dull face. The next chapter turns from Rudolf IV's Vienna to Frederick III's long game. From stone and parchment to the politics of endurance, where the Habsburgs learned that a family could win not by moving quickly, but by remaining when everyone else had exhausted themselves. Some rulers enter history on horseback. Frederick III entered it like a man closing a door and checking the lock. He was not the kind of monarch who made chroniclers reach first for thunder. He did not resemble the heroic conqueror, the dazzling court prince, or the warrior king whose life can be reduced to a series of bright, violent scenes. His reign was long, cautious, stubborn, often frustrating, and at times humiliating. To enemies he looked slow, to critics passive, to impatient men almost asleep. But dynasties are not always built by the fastest hand. Sometimes they are built by the one that refuses to let go. Before Frederick, there had been a brief moment when the Habsburgs seemed ready to return to the highest stage of Central Europe. Albert II of Habsburg, son-in-law of Emperor Sigismund, became King of Hungary and Bohemia through dynastic connection, and was elected King of the Romans in 1438. For the Habsburgs, this mattered enormously. After the long failures and exclusions of the 14th century, after the Golden Bull had confirmed their absence from the Electoral College, after Rudolf IV had answered with forged dignity and Viennese ambition, a Habsburg once again stood at the centre of royal possibility. Albert II held several crowns at once. Then he died in 1439. The door opened and nearly closed in the same breath. His death left behind uncertainty, competing expectations, and the posthumous son, Ladislaus, born after his father was gone. In dynastic politics, an unborn child could become a kingdom's hope, a faction's tool, and the rival's problem before he had ever seen daylight. The Habsburg future had again become dependent on timing, on birth, guardianship, recognition, and the ability of older men to manage the rights of a child. Out of this unstable world came Frederick. In 1440, Frederick of the Styrian branch of the Habsburgs was elected King of the Romans. Later, in 1452, he would be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, the last emperor to receive that coronation in the city itself from a pope. The image has a certain grandeur: Rome, ceremony, imperial title, sacred language, the old claim that the empire still carried the weight of universal Christian order. But ceremony did not make Frederick rich. It did not make the princes obedient. It did not solve Austria's internal divisions, Hungary's pressures, Bohemian instability, or the difficulty of turning a grand title into daily command. This was the paradox of Frederick's life. He possessed one of the highest dignities in Europe, yet often lacked the material power that viewers might expect such a dignity to bring. The Holy Roman Emperor could look magnificent in ritual and limited in practice. He could sign with authority and still bargain like a man surrounded by stronger neighbors. His title was enormous. His resources were not. Frederick understood this gap better than his enemies realized. A reckless ruler might have tried to erase it through constant war. Frederick often chose delay, withdrawal, negotiation, legal patience, and dynastic positioning. This made him appear weak, especially to men who mistook movement for strength. But the Habsburg story had already taught the family that direct force could fail. In Swiss passes, on imperial battlefields, under the pressure of resistant princes. Frederick inherited that education. He did not need to look glorious every year. He needed the house to remain. Imagine his court not as a place of uninterrupted majesty, but as a room crowded with petitions from territories that did not fit together cleanly. A clerk bends over a desk, sorting complaints from nobles, towns, monasteries, and rival claimants. Wax seals crack. Dust gathers in folded letters. One document speaks of Austrian rights, another of imperial procedure, another of a child's inheritance, another of a noble's refusal to obey. The emperor's name stands above them all, but the problems below the name are stubbornly local. This was the daily texture of composite power before the Habsburgs became famous for it. Not one unified state, a stack of obligations. Frederick's reign was shaped by the need to preserve Habsburg claims without having the means to impose them everywhere at once. He had to navigate the legacy of Albert II, the guardianship and claims surrounding Ladislaus Posthumus, tensions in Austria, and the larger pressures of Hungary and Bohemia. He also had to deal with the empire's princes, who continued to defend their privileges against any emperor who looked too assertive. The Habsburgs had learned to desire titles. Frederick had to learn how to survive their weight. His famous device, often expressed through the letters A, E, I, O, U, has been interpreted in different ways, and later tradition gave it grand meanings about Austria's destiny. We should be careful not to treat one interpretation as certain beyond dispute. What matters is that Frederick surrounded himself with signs of dynastic claim and imperial self-consciousness. He understood, like Rudolf IV before him, that symbols could wait for the world to catch up. A motto did not win a battle, but it preserved an intention. And Frederick was a man of intentions preserved over time. His reign was not free of humiliation. Perhaps the most painful came from Matthias Corvinus, the powerful king of Hungary. In the later 15th century, Matthias pressed hard against Habsburg power and eventually occupied Vienna in 1485. For any emperor, losing control of such a symbolic city was a wound. For a Habsburg, after generations of making Vienna look worthy of greatness, it cut even deeper. An impatient viewer might stop there and call Frederick a failure. That would be too simple. Because Frederick's genius, if we can call it that, was not the genius of preventing every defeat. It was the genius of not allowing defeat to become extinction. He could lose face, lose ground, lose time, and still keep the dynastic line positioned for recovery. He did not always win the visible contest, but he preserved the board on which his son would move. That son was Maximilian. Born in 1459, Maximilian inherited from Frederick not a clean empire, but a method. Endure the present, preserve the claim, marry strategically, and allow time to turn weakness into opportunity. Maximilian would be more energetic, more chivalric, more theatrical, more willing to chase battlefield and marriage alliance alike. But without Frederick's long-holding action, there might have been no platform from which Maximilian could leap. This is the part of the Habsburg story where patience becomes an inheritance. Frederick's 1452 journey to Rome and imperial coronation gave the family a renewed aura. His marriage to Eleanor of Portugal that same year connected him with another royal house, and eventually produced Maximilian. His long survival on the imperial stage meant that, despite setbacks, the Habsburg name remained attached to the highest title in Christendom's political imagination. Other men may have seemed stronger in particular years. Frederick outlasted the shape of their strength. That is not glamorous, but it is dynastic. For ordinary subjects, Frederick's long reign did not feel like a clear master plan unfolding from above. It felt like uncertainty stretched across decades. Contested jurisdictions, changing local pressures, rival soldiers, tax demands, noble feuds, and the strange distance between imperial ceremony and village life. A man in an Austrian town might hear that the emperor had been crowned in Rome, then later hear of Hungarian pressure near home. The title was universal. The danger was local. This gap between grandeur and weakness could have destroyed the Habsburg myth. Instead, the family absorbed it. They learned that a title could be kept alive even when power was thin. They learned that claims did not need immediate fulfillment to remain useful. They learned that humiliation, if survived, could become only an episode in a longer family memory. Frederick's reign trained the dynasty to think beyond the rhythm of a single victory or defeat. That training was about to matter more than ever. Because while Frederick waited, endured, and preserved, another power was rising and glittering to the west: Burgundy. The Burgundian court was almost everything Frederick's style was not. It was wealthy, brilliant, theatrical, and aggressive. Its dukes built a culture of splendor that made them look nearly royal. Its cities in the Low Countries were rich with cloth, trade, and urban confidence. Its ambitions pressed dangerously between France and the Empire. And then came Charles the Bold. Charles did not want merely to be a great duke. He wanted a kingdom in all but name. Perhaps more than name. He expanded, fought, negotiated, and dreamed in a scale large enough to alarm both France and the Empire. His power looked dazzling. His future looked enormous. But dazzling futures can die in the snow. In 1477, Charles the Bold was killed outside Nancy. His only child, Mary of Burgundy, inherited a crisis. France moved quickly. The Burgundian lands trembled. The Low Countries looked toward their privileges. Europe watched the question open: who would marry the heiress, and who would inherit the danger? This was the kind of moment Frederick's entire life had prepared the Habsburgs to recognize. Not because he had conquered Burgundy, not because he had outshone Charles, but because he had kept his dynasty in the game long enough for chance to become strategy. The next chapter returns to the wedding room in Ghent, not as a cold opening now, but as the payoff of everything that came before. The castle in Aargau, the election of Rudolf, the conquest of Austria, the failures of the sword, the forged dignity of Rudolf IV, the staged greatness of Vienna, and Frederick's long refusal to disappear. Burgundy would prove what the Habsburgs had been learning for centuries. A family does not need to win every war if it can survive until the right inheritance becomes available. Burgundy glittered like a kingdom that had not yet been allowed to call itself one. Its dukes had built something dangerous in the space between France and the Empire. A chain of territories, cities, ambitions, and ceremonies that made lesser rulers look provincial by comparison. Their court dazzled Europe with silk, music, tournaments, tapestries, and the theatrical confidence of men who believed splendor could become sovereignty if displayed long enough. But splendor is not succession. In January 1477, outside Nancy, Charles the Bold was killed after a campaign that had pushed his ambition past the limits of fortune. His body, according to later accounts, was found damaged and difficult to recognize. A brutal end for a prince who had tried to build a realm from the fragments of Europe's political map. With his death, Burgundy became a question, and the answer was a young woman. Mary of Burgundy was not merely Charles's daughter, she was his heir. In the language of dynastic politics, that made her one of the most valuable and vulnerable people in Europe. Her inheritance included the rich Burgundian Netherlands, territories whose cities breathed money through cloth, trade, banking, ports, guilds, and urban privilege. But it also included danger. French claims, local resistance, legal complexity, and the terrible fact that an heiress could carry power without being allowed to control the forces gathering around it. Mary inherited not a peaceful realm, but a crisis with jewels on it. The French king, Louis XI, moved quickly. France had long watched Burgundian power with suspicion and appetite. Charles the Bold had been both rival and obstacle. A duke whose ambitions threatened to create a middle kingdom between France and the Empire. Now Charles was dead. His heir was unmarried. The question became urgent. Would Burgundy be absorbed, divided, defended, or married into another dynasty? France wanted gravity to pull Burgundy back. The Habsburgs wanted marriage to pull it east. For Frederick III and his son Maximilian, the opportunity was enormous. The Habsburgs had spent centuries struggling to convert rank into durable power. They had won Austria, lost battles, forged dignity, staged Vienna, survived humiliation, and waited. Now the logic of dynastic patience stood before them in human form. An heiress whose marriage could do what armies had failed to do quickly. But Mary was not a prize lying silently on a table. She was a ruler under pressure. The Burgundian lands were not a simple inheritance that could be transferred like a ring. The Low Countries were wealthy, proud, and politically sensitive. Their cities defended privileges with the seriousness of fortresses. Ghent, Bruges, Brussels, Leuven, and the other urban powers did not exist merely to obey the romantic designs of princes. They had charters, guilds, councils, traditions, and money. They expected negotiation. This is why 1477 was so explosive. Mary had to defend her inheritance against France, while also satisfying subjects who feared centralization and foreign domination. In February of that year, she issued the Great Privilege, granting major concessions to the provinces and cities of the Burgundian Netherlands. It was not a sign of calm strength. It was the price of survival. A ruler in crisis often discovers that loyalty has an invoice. The Great Privilege showed that Burgundy's wealth did not make Mary free. It made her necessary to many people, and therefore vulnerable to all of them. The cities wanted their rights confirmed. The nobles wanted influence. France wanted territory. The Habsburgs wanted a marriage. Every faction could speak the language of protection while calculating advantage. Inside this pressure, the wedding took shape. In August 1477, Mary married Maximilian of Habsburg at Ghent. The ceremony has often been remembered through the shining simplicity of dynastic success. The Habsburgs married Burgundy. But that phrase hides the tension in the room. Maximilian did not walk into a peaceful inheritance. He entered a contested political world where his authority had to be accepted, financed, defended, and translated into local terms. Marriage gave him a claim, It did not give him automatic obedience. A wedding can open a gate. It cannot force every city to love the man who walks through it. Imagine a cloth merchant in Bruges in the months after the marriage. His hands know the weight of wool, the texture of finished cloth, the sound of coin on a counter. He hears the names Mary, Maximilian, Louis, France, Habsburg. But these names become real to him only when trade is threatened, when taxes rise, when soldiers move, when privileges are confirmed or ignored, when the road to a market becomes less safe than last year. For him, dynastic marriage is not romance. It is risk pricing. This is the human underside of the Habsburg miracle. Every great marriage produced not only a family tree, but a chain of local consequences. A bride could bring territory into a new orbit, but the people of that territory still had to live with the orbit. They paid in taxes, anxiety, uncertain allegiance, and sometimes war. For Maximilian, Burgundy was both glory and trap. He was young, ambitious, and shaped by the Habsburg inheritance of patience and claim. But he also carried a different temperament from Frederick III. Maximilian loved chivalric display, martial honor, and bold political gesture. Burgundy must have seemed like a stage large enough for him. It offered wealth, prestige, and a Western future that could raise Habsburg power beyond the Austrian base. Yet Burgundy also forced him into immediate conflict with France. The French crown did not accept Habsburg access to the Burgundian inheritance as a harmless family matter. Why would it? A Habsburg presence in the Low Countries placed a rival dynasty near France's northern and eastern approaches. The marriage threatened to surround France with claims that were lawful enough to be dangerous and foreign enough to be intolerable. So the wedding did not prevent war. It reorganized war around inheritance. This is the point where the old phrase about Austria marrying instead of fighting becomes dangerously incomplete. Maximilian's marriage to Mary did not allow the Habsburgs to avoid the sword. It gave them a reason to draw it under a better title. They were no longer outsiders trying to seize Burgundy. They were defenders of Mary's inheritance, guardians of a dynastic claim, participants in a legal and familial struggle that could be presented as rightful resistance to French aggression. Legitimacy changed the costume of violence. The conflict that followed was not a simple duel between love and ambition, or France and Austria, or old Burgundy and new Habsburg. It was a dense struggle among monarchy, cities, estates, inheritance law, military pressure, and local privilege. Maximilian needed money and obedience from lands that were wealthy precisely because they were politically sophisticated. Mary needed protection without losing the support of her subjects. France needed to prevent a strategic nightmare. No one had a clean path. Then, in 1482, Mary died after a riding accident. She was still young. Her death changed the emotional and political texture of the entire inheritance. Maximilian's claim now depended heavily on his role as father and guardian of their children, especially Philip. The Burgundian lands became even harder to hold, because Mary herself had been the source of native legitimacy. Without her living presence, Maximilian looked more foreign, more vulnerable, and more dependent on negotiation, force, and the rights of a child. The bride who changed the map was gone. The map remained unstable. This is one of the cruelest truths of dynastic politics. The person who carries legitimacy may be less protected by that legitimacy than the territories attached to her name. Mary's value came from inheritance. But inheritance also turned her life into a contested space. Her marriage reshaped Europe. Her death intensified the struggle over what that marriage had created. For the Habsburgs, however, the long consequence was undeniable. Burgundy opened the West. The Low Countries brought wealth, urban sophistication, and a strategic position that transformed Habsburg rivalry with France into a central drama of European politics. From this point forward, the Habsburgs were no longer only an Austrian house trying to secure dignity inside the empire. They had become a dynasty with claims that pressed against France, stretched into the commercial heart of northern Europe, and prepared the way for a scale of power unimaginable from the old castle in Aargau. This was the payoff of centuries. The small castle had given them a name. Rudolf I had given them Austria. Rudolf IV had given Austria a myth of rank. Vienna had given that myth a skyline. Frederick III had preserved the imperial connection long enough for chance to become strategy. Mary of Burgundy gave the Habsburgs something none of those earlier victories could provide by itself: a Western inheritance rich enough to make Europe afraid. But fear is never passive. France would not forget. The Low Countries would not simply obey. Maximilian would spend years trying to hold together what marriage had brought him. The Burgundian inheritance became both treasure and battlefield, a source of wealth and a generator of conflict. It made Habsburg power larger, but also more exposed. It turned the family into a continental force, but also tied it to wars that would echo far beyond Mary's lifetime. Here, the Habsburg method appears in its mature medieval form. Not peaceful, not simple, not lucky in the childish sense. It was a strategy built on recognizing that Europe's political map was full of hinges: daughters, widows, sons, contracts, disputed rights, vulnerable successions, and territories whose legal status could shift faster than armies could march. The Habsburgs learned to stand near those hinges. When the door opened, they entered. The marriage of Mary and Maximilian did not complete the Habsburg rise, it escalated it. It proved that the family's future would no longer be measured only in Austria or imperial elections. From now on, their story would be tied to France, the Low Countries, Spain, and the problem of governing territories that came through blood, but had to be held through money, diplomacy, and force. And Spain was closer than it looked. A generation after Mary's wedding, another marriage would carry the Habsburg name into an inheritance even greater and more unexpected. This time the bride would be Joanna of Castile, the groom Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian and Mary. The Burgundian marriage had changed the map of Europe. The Spanish marriage would open the ocean. A map can change before anyone understands what has happened to it. At first, the marriage looked like diplomacy, not destiny. In 1496, Philip the Handsome, son of Maximilian of Habsburg and Mary of Burgundy, married Joanna of Castile, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. To the people arranging it, the union made political sense. Habsburg and Spain shared a powerful enemy in France. Burgundy had already pulled the Habsburgs into the Western struggle. Spain, newly strengthened under Ferdinand and Isabella, needed alliances in a Europe where every royal marriage was also a defensive war. So a son of Austria and Burgundy married a daughter of Castile and Aragon. A useful alliance, a respectable match, a diplomatic move against France. But dynastic politics has a talent for turning ordinary intentions into consequences no one fully planned. Joanna was not originally expected to inherit everything. In the world of her parents, succession had other paths. There were other children, other hopes, other arrangements. Royal families plan as if death will obey protocol. It rarely does. One by one, the expected lines of succession changed through deaths, failed hopes, and fragile heirs. What began as an alliance gradually became a doorway into Spain. And Spain was no ordinary prize. By the late 15th century, Castile and Aragon stood at the edge of a new age. In 1492, Granada had fallen, ending the last Muslim kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. That same year, Columbus sailed west under Castilian sponsorship, opening a chain of consequences that would transform not only Spain, but the Atlantic world. The Spanish monarchy was not yet the centralized nation-state of later imagination. It was still a composite structure, with Castile and Aragon preserving distinct laws, institutions, fiscal systems, and political traditions. But it had momentum. It had soldiers. It had religious confidence. It had maritime horizons that Europe had not yet fully measured. When Philip married Joanna, the Habsburgs did not immediately inherit an empire. They entered a family network whose future had become unstable enough to become enormous. That instability mattered more than any wedding celebration. A marriage contract can look fixed. Succession is alive. It changes with every birth, illness, death, and political maneuver. Joanna stood at the center of that living uncertainty. History has often remembered her through the name Joanna the Mad, but that label should be handled with care. It belongs to a world of court politics, gendered judgment, dynastic conflict, grief, confinement, and later interpretation. Her mental health has been discussed for centuries, but the political use of her reputation is just as important as the condition itself. In a monarchy where legitimacy passed through her blood, controlling Joanna meant controlling the doorway to power. She was not merely a tragic woman in a palace. She was a legal passage. That made her dangerous to others, even when she was personally vulnerable. Imagine a Castilian notary at a desk, copying names into a marriage record by candlelight. Philip, Joanna, Habsburg, Trastamara, Burgundy, Castile, Aragon. The ink dries in ordinary strokes. The room may smell of wax, leather, dust, and wool damp from winter air. No ocean appears on the parchment. No emperor stands in the margin. No one looking at the line of names can yet see Charles V ruling territories so vast that the old European scale begins to break. But the names are enough. They are seeds. When Joanna's brother John died in 1497, the succession shifted. When her sister Isabella died in 1498, and Isabella's son Miguel died in 1500, Joanna's position changed dramatically. What had been unlikely became possible. What had been possible became central. Through Joanna, the Habsburg line drew closer to the Spanish inheritance. This was the kind of event that made the Habsburg method look almost supernatural to later observers. A marriage made for alliance becomes a path to monarchy. A daughter, not first expected to carry the entire inheritance, becomes indispensable. A child born from the union becomes the meeting point of Austria, Burgundy, Castile, Aragon, and eventually the overseas world. But there was nothing magical about it. It was the brutal arithmetic of dynastic Europe. Habsburg power grew because the family placed itself where succession might break open. That did not mean they controlled every accident. They did not command death. They did not script every failure of the Spanish line. but they had learned to position their bloodline near enough to great houses that when death did its work, Habsburg claims were already in the room. Philip the Handsome benefited from this positioning. He was not only Maximilian's son, he was the living product of the Burgundian marriage that had transformed Habsburg power in the previous generation. Through him, Burgundy did not remain a Western acquisition. It became a bridge. His marriage to Joanna connected that Burgundian Habsburg inheritance to Iberia. Their son, Charles, born in Ghent in 1500, would inherit a collection of territories so vast and varied that no single medieval kingdom could contain the meaning of it. Charles was not born into a country. He was born into a problem. This problem would define the Habsburg future. Their strength came from accumulation, but accumulation did not produce simplicity. Burgundy had brought wealthy cities and conflict with France. Spain brought Castile, Aragon, Naples, Mediterranean concerns, Atlantic expansion, and eventually the Americas. Austria remained the family's old foundation. The empire still mattered. Each inheritance arrived with laws, expectations, elites, councils, languages, taxes, and enemies of its own. A dynasty could inherit a map faster than it could govern one. That was the hidden cost of the Spanish marriage. In the short term, it strengthened the anti-French alignment and widened Habsburg possibilities beyond anything Frederick III could have imagined in his cautious rooms. In the long term, it helped create the vast composite monarchy of Charles V, a structure of dazzling prestige and relentless pressure. To praise the marriage as pure success is to miss the burden inside the success. The Habsburgs had learned to win through inheritance. Now inheritance began to outgrow human scale. For Joanna, the cost was more intimate. Her life became trapped inside the machinery her bloodline empowered. After Isabella's death in 1504, Joanna became Queen of Castile, but real authority became contested among her husband Philip, her father Ferdinand, and later her son Charles. Her capacity to rule was challenged, interpreted, and politically managed. Whatever the truth of her suffering, the political consequence is clear. The woman through whom legitimacy passed was increasingly denied the practical exercise of that legitimacy. That contradiction should not be softened. Dynastic Europe could elevate a woman's blood while restraining her person. A queen could be indispensable and imprisoned by the same fact. The Habsburg story, when told only through maps, can make this look clean. Burgundy passes here, Spain passes there, Bohemia and Hungary follow later. Lines connect, crowns accumulate. The family tree becomes a machine of triumph. But inside those lines were bodies. Mary of Burgundy, under pressure after her father's death. Joanna of Castile, transformed from daughter and bride into the contested vessel of succession. Children treated not only as children, but as future solutions to diplomatic anxieties. Marriages celebrated with ritual, while carrying the weight of armies not yet raised. The Habsburg method was effective because it was human. That is also why it was cruel. Spain opened a new scale of power, but it also opened a new scale of rivalry. A Habsburg connected to Spain, Burgundy, and Austria was no longer merely one dynasty among many inside the empire. It became the central anxiety of France. The French monarchy now faced the possibility of Habsburg pressure from multiple directions. The Low Countries to the north, imperial lands to the east, Spain to the south, and Italian conflicts pulling everyone into overlapping wars. The marriage did not end conflict. It arranged the battlefield around family law. By the time Charles came of age, the consequences of these marriages would become almost too large for one ruler. He would inherit the Burgundian Netherlands from his father's line, Spain from his mother's, the Austrian Habsburg connection from his grandfather's house, and eventually, the imperial crown. Later generations would look at his dominions and speak of a monarchy on which the sun never set. But that phrase hides the administrative exhaustion beneath the glory. Sunlight can reach many places, so can debt. The Spanish marriage, therefore, marks a turning point in the Habsburg saga. Until now, their rise had been mostly Central European and Burgundian. Aargau, Austria, the Empire, Vienna, Burgundy, the Low Countries. After Joanna and Philip, the story begins to stretch beyond the medieval frame. It moves toward Atlantic routes, Italian wars, religious upheaval, imperial overstretch, and the terrifying inheritance of Charles V. This is why the chapter belongs at the edge of the Middle Ages. It is not fully medieval anymore, but it is the result of medieval habits. Marriage, succession, bloodline, dynastic contract, composite rule. All the tools the Habsburgs had sharpened across centuries now produced something far larger than the world that had created them. The old method survived into a new age. And because it survived, it carried old assumptions into global politics. That a family could hold distant lands together through inheritance. That legitimacy could travel through blood. That law could stretch across languages, seas, and continents. In 1496, the marriage of Philip and Joanna may have looked like another alliance against France. In hindsight, it was one of the hinges of European history. The Burgundian marriage had taught the Habsburgs that a bride could change the map. The Spanish marriage taught them that a bride could change the world. But even this was not the final proof of the method. To the east, in Bohemia and Hungary, another chain of marriages and succession agreements was forming. There the prize would come with a different kind of danger. Not the Atlantic, not the Low Countries, not France alone, but the Ottoman frontier. The Habsburgs had learned how to inherit crowns. Now they would learn that every crown comes with a border someone else wants to cross. Some crowns are not seized at once. They wait. They sit inside treaties, marriage contracts, family trees, and polite ceremonies where everyone smiles because the violence has not arrived yet. They are not placed on the head immediately. They are stored inside possibility, waiting for illness, childbirth, defeat, or a battlefield accident to make them real. For the Habsburgs, Bohemia and Hungary belonged to this darker kind of inheritance. By the early 16th century, the family had already learned how far marriage could reach. Burgundy had opened the west. Spain had opened the ocean. Austria remained the old territorial heart. The imperial title hovered above the family like an inheritance not always secure, but always desired. The Habsburgs were no longer simply a house trying to prove it deserved recognition. They had become a family others had to plan around. But Central Europe still held another prize, and another danger. Bohemia and Hungary were not minor additions to a dynastic collection. Bohemia carried weight inside the Holy Roman Empire, with its own crown, estates, religious tensions and political traditions. Hungary stretched toward the Danube frontier, toward the Balkans, toward the long pressure of Ottoman expansion. To inherit these crowns was not merely to gain prestige, it was to inherit a gate, and beyond that gate stood the Ottoman world. The Habsburg path into Bohemia and Hungary did not begin with a spectacular conquest. It moved through marriage diplomacy with the Jagiellonian dynasty. The Jagiellons ruled in Bohemia and Hungary, but like every ruling house, they lived under the old dynastic terror. What happens if the line fails? If the heir dies? If the next generation cannot hold what the previous one arranged? In 1515, in Vienna, Habsburg and Jagiellonian interests were bound together through a major double marriage arrangement. The politics were intricate, but the logic was clear. The Habsburgs and the Jagiellons created family connections that could become succession claims if death opened the way. Ferdinand of Habsburg, brother of Charles V, was connected to Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Mary of Austria, another Habsburg, was linked to Louis, the young Jagiellonian heir. The ceremony could be dressed in beauty. The meaning was calculation. A wedding hall can hide a frontier. Imagine the scene not as romance, but as choreography. Nobles stand beneath expensive cloth. Latin words are spoken. Hands are joined. Witnesses watch carefully. Outside the ritual, envoys understand what is being built. A legal bridge between houses. No one can know when or whether that bridge will be crossed, but everyone knows why it is there. This is dynastic patience in its purest form. The Habsburgs did not need Bohemia and Hungary immediately. They needed a recognized path toward them. A marriage did not have to produce power at once. It only had to place the family close enough to succession that a future crisis would not find them outside the door. That crisis came in 1526. At the Battle of Mohács, King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia was killed fighting the Ottomans under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The battle was catastrophic for Hungary. Medieval chronicles and later national memory would turn Mohács into a wound far larger than a single military defeat, because it marked the collapse of an old order and opened the kingdom to division, occupation, and foreign struggle. For the Habsburgs, Louis's death activated the marriage logic of 1515. Ferdinand of Habsburg, married to Anna, claimed the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. The claim was not uncontested, especially in Hungary, where local politics, noble choices, Ottoman pressure, and rival claims made the situation far more complicated than a clean inheritance. But the Habsburgs had something they always wanted in moments of crisis: a lawful argument already prepared. They could say they were not merely invading, they were inheriting. That distinction did not make the struggle peaceful. It made the struggle legitimate enough to endure. In Bohemia, Ferdinand's position became more stable than in Hungary, though even there the crown came with its own estates, traditions, and religious complexities. Hungary was more dangerous. The kingdom fractured. John Zápolya emerged as a rival claimant, supported by significant Hungarian forces, and later connected to Ottoman backing. The Habsburg claim entered a battlefield of local loyalty and imperial rivalry. A marriage had opened the door. Mohács filled the doorway with smoke. Picture a soldier on the Hungarian frontier after the catastrophe. He does not see a family tree. He sees broken equipment, exhausted horses, refugees moving with what they can carry, priests trying to explain defeat, nobles arguing about allegiance, and rumors moving faster than orders. He hears that Louis is dead. He hears that Ferdinand claims the crown. He hears another name too, another lord, another faction, another army. To the people near the frontier, succession was not an abstract legal problem. It was the question of who would defend the next town. This was the burden hidden inside Habsburg success. Burgundy had brought conflict with France and resistance from wealthy cities. Spain had brought Atlantic scale, Castilian politics, and the future weight of a global monarchy. Bohemia and Hungary brought something different: direct exposure to Ottoman expansion and the long militarization of Central Europe. The Habsburgs gained crowns. They also gained a permanent emergency. The Battle of Mohács belongs just beyond the strict medieval boundary, but it is essential to this story because it reveals what medieval dynastic tools produced at the edge of the modern world. The method was old: marriage, succession, lawful claim, inheritance through blood. The consequence was new in scale: a Habsburg frontier against one of the most powerful empires on earth. Ferdinand did not inherit a settled kingdom. He inherited a crisis with a crown attached. That pattern should sound familiar by now. Mary of Burgundy had inherited a crisis after Charles the Bold died. Joanna of Castile had become central because expected heirs died. Now Louis II's death at Mohács turned marriage agreements into Habsburg claims over Bohemia and Hungary. Again and again, the family's rise depended on the same harsh mechanism: be close to the line of succession when the line breaks. But every break cut someone. In Bohemia, nobles and estates had to negotiate what Habsburg kingship would mean for their privileges. In Hungary, rival claimants and Ottoman pressure ensured that the crown could not simply be worn from a distance. Towns, villages, fortresses, and noble households were pulled into a frontier struggle that would define Habsburg history for centuries. The wedding of 1515 had looked like diplomacy. After 1526, it looked like prophecy. Yet prophecy is the wrong word. The Habsburgs were not magicians. They did not know exactly how Louis would die, when the Ottoman threat would break Hungary, or how fiercely local factions would resist. Their strength was not supernatural foresight. It was positioning. They placed family ties where future crises might turn them into rights. This was the mature form of the Habsburg method. Not simply marriage, prepared inheritance. A wedding without a succession possibility was only an alliance. A wedding placed near a vulnerable crown was a delayed political weapon. It could sleep for years. Then a battlefield, a death, or a childless line could wake it. Mohács woke it. The result transformed the Habsburgs again. With Bohemia and Hungary added to their claims, they became more deeply embedded in Central and Eastern European politics. The Austrian base no longer looked merely like a regional heartland. It became the western side of a frontier system. Vienna, once taught to look imperial by Rudolf IV, would now stand closer to danger than symbolism alone could handle. A city can perform greatness. It must also survive siege. The Ottoman pressure that followed was not a decorative background to Habsburg history. It shaped taxation, military organization, diplomacy, identity, and the very meaning of Habsburg rule in Central Europe. The family that had risen through claims and marriages now had to present itself as defender of Christian Europe, guardian of frontiers, and manager of lands whose histories did not merge easily into one dynastic story. The Habsburgs had become larger again, and less simple again. This is the repeated irony of their rise. Every successful inheritance solved an old problem while creating a new one. Austria solved the problem of territorial weakness. Burgundy solved the problem of Western prestige and wealth. Spain solved the problem of scale and royal magnitude. Bohemia and Hungary solved the problem of Central European expansion. But Austria required defense and administration. Burgundy required war with France and negotiation with cities. Spain required governing across seas and kingdoms. Bohemia and Hungary required a frontier against the Ottomans and endless bargaining with local elites. The Habsburgs did not conquer Europe in the simple sense. They inherited Europe's complications. By the time Ferdinand pressed his claims after Mohacs, the old Habsburg story from Argyll had become almost unrecognizable. The hill castle was still there in memory, but the family name now moved through Vienna, Brussels, Madrid, Prague, Buda, and beyond. It had become a political web large enough to impress enemies and exhaust administrators. The method had worked. That was the danger, because success on this scale changed the nature of the family. The Habsburgs were no longer merely trying to rise, they were trying to hold. Holding is a different kind of violence. It requires taxes, soldiers, marriages, treaties, governors, councils, punishments, compromises, and stories people can be persuaded to believe. It requires turning inheritance into government, and government into obedience. A claim can be written in one day. A kingdom must be managed every year. That was the burden waiting behind the crowns of Bohemia and Hungary. Ferdinand's legal right mattered. His marriage mattered. The Vienna arrangements mattered. But none of them abolished the realities of distance, language, local privilege, religious division, noble autonomy, or Ottoman force. The Habsburgs had learned how to enter through the door of inheritance. Now they had to live in the house. And the house was full of fire. The next chapter brings the story back across the whole arc, from the small castle in Argyll to the wedding contracts of Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, and Hungary. It asks what the Habsburg method truly achieved, what it cost, and why a dynasty that seems to win without war ended up surrounded by more wars than almost anyone else. Because the final lesson is not that marriage saved the Habsburgs from violence. It is that marriage gave them a lawful reason to inherit violence. At the end of the story, there is no single battlefield large enough to explain the Habsburgs. No one plain of mud and blood. No one siege. No one heroic charge that turned a small family from Argyll into one of the most powerful dynasties in Europe. The truer image is quieter. A table under candlelight. A map half covered by contracts. A wedding ring lying beside a seal. A sword present but not always drawn. Names written carefully, because one misplaced name could change the future of a kingdom. That was the Habsburg world. Not a world without violence, but a world where violence often arrived after the paperwork had already chosen its direction. The old phrase attached to the dynasty says, "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." It survives because it captures something real. The Habsburgs did become famous for using marriage in a way that few dynasties matched. Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, Hungary. Again and again, the family appeared at the edge of a succession crisis, close enough to transform a death into a claim and a claim into territory. But the phrase is dangerous if taken too literally. The Habsburgs did not avoid war. They inherited reasons for war. They fought for Austria after Rudolf I challenged Ottokar II. They were humiliated at Morgarten. Frederick the Fair lost at Mühldorf. Maximilian's Burgundian marriage drew him into conflict with France and resistance in the Low Countries. The Spanish connection placed Habsburg power inside the great rivalries of Western Europe and beyond. Bohemia and Hungary brought them toward the Ottoman frontier, where a crown could feel less like an ornament and more like a burning gate. Marriage did not replace the sword. It gave the sword a legal title. That is the deeper Habsburg lesson. Their achievement was not simply that they married well. Many dynasties married well. Royal Europe was built on such unions. What made the Habsburgs extraordinary was their ability to combine marriage with patience, legal memory, territorial persistence, and symbolic ambition. They understood that a claim could sleep for years before waking into power. They understood that one generation might plant a right which another would harvest. They understood that a family tree could be as strategic as a battle plan. Their first tool was not glamour, it was survival. From the castle in Aargau, the early Habsburgs learned the politics of accumulation. Land, rights, abbey ties, local lordship, small advantages hardened by time. Nothing about that beginning demanded an imperial future. The castle could have remained a regional memory. The name could have vanished into another house's inheritance. Many noble names did. But the Habsburgs endured long enough for usefulness to become opportunity. Rudolf I was chosen in 1273 because the princes of the Holy Roman Empire wanted a king who could restore order without mastering them. They thought they had found a controlled solution. Rudolf turned that solution into a dynastic opening. He used the crown not as a possession he could pass down, but as leverage. Austria and Styria became the family's durable foundation. In 1282, when he invested his sons with those lands, the Habsburgs stopped being merely a family that had reached kingship. They became a house with a future rooted in territory. Then came the failures. Albert I learned that the empire would not easily become family property. His assassination in 1308 revealed that bloodline could generate violence inside the house as well as claims outside it. Morgarten showed that local communities and geography could defeat aristocratic force. Mühldorf showed that a Habsburg bid for kingship could end in capture and postponement. The Golden Bull of 1356 placed the humiliation into law by fixing the electoral order without granting Austria the status the family believed it deserved. A weaker house might have accepted the ceiling. The Habsburgs wrote upward. Rudolf IV's Privilegium Maius was false in origin, but honest in what it revealed. It exposed the family's hunger for recognized rank. It tried to give Austria an ancient dignity the imperial structure had denied it. It showed that Habsburg power would not be built only with troops, but with archives, seals, titles, and the political use of memory. Vienna then became the stage. St. Stephen's Cathedral, the University of Vienna, ceremonies, stone, learning, and urban prestige all helped teach Austria to look larger than the empire's official hierarchy allowed. The city became a visible argument. A passerby did not need to read the forged documents to understand the message. This house intended to be treated as exceptional. Frederick III carried that intention through time. He was not spectacular in the way impatient men admire. He lost ground. He suffered humiliation. Vienna itself fell to Matthias Corvinus in 1485. Yet Frederick preserved the Habsburg place near imperial power and left his son Maximilian something more useful than glory: position. The family remained alive, titled, connected, and ready. Then Burgundy opened. Mary of Burgundy's marriage to Maximilian in 1477 changed the scale of Habsburg ambition. The Low Countries brought wealth, cities, trade, and conflict with France. It was the clearest medieval proof of the method. A woman's inheritance could move more territory than a cavalry charge. But it also revealed the cost. Burgundy did not arrive as obedient treasure. It came with urban privileges, French pressure, local resistance, and years of struggle. Spain widened the pattern beyond anything the old Counts of Argau could have imagined. Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile married in 1496 as part of a diplomatic alignment against France. But dynastic accidents transformed that match into a road toward the Spanish inheritance. Joanna's blood carried legitimacy, even as her own power was contested, restrained, and interpreted by men around her. Their son Charles would inherit a world too large for any simple monarchy. Austria, Burgundy, Spain, imperial ambition, and overseas territories that pulled European politics across the Atlantic. Then Bohemia and Hungary showed the final edge of the method. The Vienna marriage arrangements of 1515 placed Habsburg claims beside Jagiellonian succession. When Louis II died at Mohács in 1526, Ferdinand of Habsburg could claim Bohemia and Hungary through marriage and blood. But the inheritance brought not peace, but frontier pressure, Ottoman expansion, rival claimants, noble bargaining, and the burden of defending Central Europe. By then, the pattern was unmistakable. Every Habsburg success solved one problem and opened another. Austria solved weakness. Burgundy opened wealth and Western rivalry. Spain opened oceans and imperial overextension. Bohemia and Hungary opened prestige and a military frontier. The family rose because it could inherit. It suffered because inheritance did not simplify the world. This is why the Habsburg story is not really a fairy tale about lucky marriages. It is a story about composite power. Their dominions were not one body with one heart. They were a collection of lands, laws, languages, privileges, elites, diets, councils, towns, frontiers, and memories. A single family name stretched across them, but a name is not administration. A marriage contract could connect territories in law. It could not automatically make them trust one another. It could not make a Flemish merchant, an Austrian noble, a Castilian official, a Bohemian estate, and a Hungarian frontier soldier feel that they belong to one political organism. That work had to be done every year, through taxes, through governors, through bargaining, through religion, through armies, through punishment, through myth, and through the stubborn repetition of the idea that Habsburg rule was not an accident, but legitimate order. Somewhere in an archive, generations later, a clerk or archivist could open a box and find the real weapons of the dynasty. Marriage treaties, charters, confirmations, genealogies, seals, privileges, succession agreements, and letters written in careful hands. Not all of them honest, not all of them effective, but together they formed the paper skeleton of a dynasty that learned to make law, remember its ambitions. Beside those documents, a sword might rest. It was never irrelevant. It was simply not alone. That is what separates the Habsburgs from the simpler image of medieval conquest. A conqueror may win quickly and lose quickly. A family of inheritance moves differently. It advances through births, betrothals, dowries, deaths, disputed claims, and ceremonies whose consequences may not appear for decades. Its victories can look slow because they are planted before they are visible. But slow power can be merciless. It turns children into treaties. It turns brides into borders. It turns grief into opportunity. It turns a funeral into a legal opening. Mary of Burgundy, Joanna of Castile, Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. These women were not footnotes to the Habsburg rise. They were the living passages through which power moved. The dynasty's greatness depended on them, but dependence did not always mean respect, freedom, or safety. That is one of the darker truths behind the elegant family tree. The Habsburgs built power through blood. Blood is not abstract when you are the person required to carry it. By the early modern age, the family had become almost too successful. It had created a structure so wide that no one ruler could experience it as a simple kingdom. Charles V would inherit the full burden of that success. Later Habsburg generations would divide lines, fight France, confront the Ottomans, manage religious upheaval, and try to hold together territories that had come through the logic of family but lived through the realities of politics. The medieval method had won. The modern burden had begun. So what did the Habsburgs truly teach Europe? They taught that power does not always arrive in armor. Sometimes it arrives dressed for a wedding. They taught that legitimacy can be manufactured, preserved, performed, and inherited. They taught that a small family can rise not by being strongest in every generation, but by placing itself where the next crisis will need a lawful name. And they taught something more unsettling. The quiet tools of power are not always gentler than the loud ones. A sword kills in the open. A marriage contract can decide who will pay taxes, which army will march, which language will govern a court, which child will inherit a border, and which people will wake up under a ruler they did not choose. The violence is slower, but it is still real. The Habsburgs began with a castle on a hill in Aargau. They ended this medieval arc with claims stretching across Austria, Burgundy, Spain, Bohemia, and Hungary. The distance between those two images is not explained by one genius, one battle, or one miracle. It is explained by a habit. Wait, marry, document, claim, inherit, defend, repeat. Again and again, until the family name became a map. And if we return one last time to that small castle, the silence feels different now. The stone does not look grand enough for what came after. That is the point. History often begins in places too small for their consequences. A hill, a room, a contract, a seal, a wedding few people outside the elite could fully understand. And then, decades later, armies moving because someone once wrote the right name beside the right heir. The Habsburgs did not conquer Europe by refusing war. They conquered possibility. And once possibility became inheritance, war followed them everywhere. If you want the next chapter in this series, tell us which dynasty should face the autopsy of power next. Because history is not only the story of who fought, who ruled, or who fell. It is the story of the systems people built to make obedience look natural, and the price paid when those systems finally worked too well.